Have you ever noticed that the smell of a certain perfume or cologne affects how you feel? Or have you ever gotten sick after eating at a restaurant to find that the sight or even the thought of the restaurant brings about some feelings of nausea? If you've ever made associations like these, then what you've experienced are likely the results of classical conditioning. The most famous example of classical conditioning was Ivan Pavlov's experiment with dogs. These dogs salivated in response to a bell tone. Pavlov showed that when a bell was sounded each time the dog was fed, the dog learned to associate the sound with the presentation of the food. Pavlov discovered that there are three stages to this process. The first stage is what takes place before conditioning. In this stage, the unconditioned stimulus produces an unconditioned response in the organism. In basic terms, this means that a stimulus in the environment has produced a behavior or response which is unlearned, or what we would call unconditioned, and therefore is a natural response which has not been taught. In this respect, no new behavior has been learned yet. The second stage is during conditioning. During this stage, a stimulus which produces no response, in other words, a neutral stimulus, is associated with the unconditioned stimulus, at which point it now becomes known as the conditioned stimulus. For classical conditioning to be effective, the conditioned stimulus should occur before the unconditioned stimulus rather than after it, or during the same time. Thus, the conditioned stimulus acts as a type of signal or cue for the unconditioned stimulus. In some cases, conditioning may take place if the neutral stimulus occurs after the unconditioned stimulus. We could call this backward conditioning, but this normally disappears quite quickly. The most important aspect of the conditioning stimulus is that it helps the organism predict the coming of the unconditioned stimulus. Often, during this stage, the unconditioned stimulus must be associated with the conditioned stimulus on a number of occasions or trials in order for learning to take place. However, one trial learning can happen on certain occasions when it's not necessary for an association to be strengthened over time, like being sick after food poisoning or drinking too much alcohol. So, in the case of Pavlov, he first presented the dogs with the sound of a bell. They did not salivate, so this was a neutral stimulus. Then he presented them with food, and they salivated. The food was an unconditioned stimulus, and salivation was an unconditioned or innate response. Pavlov then repeatedly presented the dogs with the sound of the bell first, and then the food. In other words, he was pairing the two, and after a few repetitions, the dogs salivated when they heard the sound of the bell. The bell had become the conditioned stimulus, and salivation had become the conditioned response. The third and final stage is after conditioning. Now, the conditioned stimulus has been associated with the unconditioned stimulus, and this happens in order to create a new conditioned response. Can you think of a time when you